Hello students. Today we will take up the first chapter from your textbook Flamingo. The title of the chapter is The Last Lesson. It is a prose which is written by Alphonse Daudet. Now let us know something about the author. Alphonse Daudet was born in Nîmes, France in the year 1840. Initially, he was a school teacher and later he quit his job to make a living as a journalist in Paris. During the Franco-Prussian War, which was held in between 1870 to 1871, the war had a profound effect on his writing. He was a French novelist and also a short story writer. Some of his major works are Robert Helmont, which he wrote in the year 1874, and Jack, which he wrote in the year 1876. Now, before we begin reading the chapter, I will give you a brief introduction of the chapter. The story, The Last Lesson, deals with the implications of linguistic chauvinism. Now, what do you understand by linguistic chauvinism? Linguistic chauvinism means carrying pride in one's language to a very far extent. Now, this chapter is an example of the insensitivity of man towards human feelings which are controlled by his aggressive attitude. This story is set in the days of the Franco-Prussian War. The story is narrated by a young schoolboy. His observations convey the arrogance of Prussians who attempted to rule over not only the territory of French people, but also over their minds and hearts. Now, after defeating France and acquiring the districts of Alsace and Lorraine, the Prussians passed an order that thenceforth schools would teach German in place of French. So, this lesson renders a touching and emotional goodbye by the teacher and his students to their national language, which is a significant aspect of an individual's identity. This story is also about the realization on the part of the French people that opportunities cannot be taken for granted. Students, we will be covering this chapter in two parts. So let us begin reading our first part. I started for school very late that morning and was in great dread of scolding, especially because M. Hamel had said that he would question us on participles, and I did not know the first word about them. For a moment, I thought of running away and spending the day out of doors. It was so warm, so bright. The birds were chirping at the edge of the woods, and in the open field back of the sawmill, the Prussian soldiers were drilling. It was all much more tempting than the rule of 4 participles, but I had the strength to resist and hurried off to school. So here, the narrator of the story is a young schoolboy. He goes to school every day, and on that specific morning, he was scared as he was late for his school. And he was also scared as their teacher M. Hamel had announced the previous day that he would test them on the topic of participles. And the boy, whose name is Franz, did not know anything at all about the participles. Therefore, he was more scared of being scolded. Then it is told that Franz had another opinion in his mind. And what was the opinion? It was to miss school and enjoy the day out in the warm and bright weather. Then he describes the scene around him and says that there were birds chirping on the trees, and the noise of the Prussian soldiers doing the drill behind the sawmill could also be heard. So the Prussian soldiers were performing their drill, and that sound could also be heard by the narrator. Now he says that the scene outside was more attractive than the school, but he controlled the temptation. But Franz controlled that temptation. He mentions that he had the strength to resist, which means that he could voluntarily refuse this temptation of not enjoying the scene, and rather chose to attend his school. Let us read further. When I passed the town hall, there was a crowd in front of the bulletin board. For the last 2 years, all the bad news had come from there. The lost battles, the draft, the orders of the commanding officer, and I thought to myself without stopping, what can be the matter now? So, as Franz walked past the town hall, he noticed a huge crowd at the notice board. Now here the readers get to know that since the last 2 years, the French people had been getting all the bad news. All the bad news? News of losing the battle, the draft, the orders of commanding officer. And what were their orders? The Prussian officers, what they did? They used to practice orders regarding the occupations of the French people. And the occupation was, what was it? The occupation was to serve the armed forces of Prussia without considering the will of the French people. So all these bad news had been communicated to the people through this bulletin board. And now Franz kept on walking towards the school and thought in his mind that what news could have been put up at the board that day. Further, then as I hurried by as fast as I could go, the blacksmith, washer, who was there with his apprentice, reading the bulletin, called after me, "Don't go so fast, bub. You will get to your school in plenty of time." So, as he walked hurriedly towards the school, he saw the blacksmith who was also reading the news, and the blacksmith had come along with his trainee, his apprentice it is mentioned. So apprentice is the trainee. So this blacksmith called out to Franz from behind and said that he need not to go in such a hurry, as there was plenty of time for him to reach the school. Then he says, I thought he was making fun of me and reached M. Hamel's little garden all out of breath. Now Franz got confused. He thought that the blacksmith was making fun of him, as he was already getting late for his school. He was already late for his school. So he thought that the blacksmith was making fun of him. And then when Franz reached the garden outside the school, he was out of breath, as he had walked very fast in order to reach the school. Let us read further. Usually when school began, there was a great bustle which could be heard out in the street. Now this paragraph is very important. These are the changes which could be seen in the school atmosphere on that particular day. So usually when school began, there was a great bustle which could be heard out in the street, the opening and closing of desks, lessons repeated in unison, very loud, with our hands over our ears to understand better, and the teacher's great ruler rapping on the table. Now Franz describes the usual scene at the school in the mornings. He says that there used to be a great bustle which means a lot of noise, created because of the opening and closing of desks. Then he says that then there would be noise of children repeating their lessons in unison. Unison here means all together children used to repeat their lessons. And also the noise of teachers striking the table with the rulers. These all noises could be heard on usual days. Let us read ahead. But now it was also still. I had counted on the commotion to get to my desk without being seen. But, of course, that day everything had to be as quiet as Sunday morning. Okay, now he says, so Franz says that on that particular day, things were not very normal. They were not very usual. He says that that it was so different as there was no noise coming out of the school, and it seemed that the school was closed as it used to be closed on Sunday mornings. And he also tells us, through the window I saw my classmates already in their places, and M. Hamel walking up and down with his terrible iron ruler under his arm. I had to open the door and go in before everybody. You can imagine how I blushed and how frightened I was. So he says that the school was very much quiet as it used to be on the day of Sunday. Now Franz gets disappointed as he had counted on the commotion to get to his desk, which means that he had planned that he would take cover under the commotion, under the noisy disturbance, and reach the class without getting noticed, without being noticed by anyone, especially without being noticed by his teacher M. Hamel. But that did not seem possible on that day. So Franz then peeped inside his class and saw his classmates that they were already seated on their seats. And M. Hamel, what was he doing? M. Hamel, their teacher, was walking in the class with his iron ruler placed under his arm. So this was very embarrassing. This was a very embarrassing situation for Franz. He was ashamed of being late. He says, I blushed. Blushed here means that he was ashamed, embarrassed for being late to school, as he had to enter the classroom in front of everyone. And moreover, he feared a scolding from M. Hamel. So finally, Franz was there at his classroom's door and he says, but nothing happened. M. Hamel saw me and said very kindly, go to your place quickly, little Franz. We were beginning without you. So when M. Hamel saw Franz, his reaction was very different from what Franz was expecting. Franz found it strange as M. Hamel did not say anything, and on the contrary, politely asked him to get to his seat and sit down. And he also says that he was almost beginning the lesson without him, and very politely asks him to go and sit on his chair. Okay, moving ahead. I jumped over the bench and sat down at my desk. Not till then, when I had got a little over my fright, did I see that our teacher had on his beautiful green coat, his frilled shirt, and the little black silk cap, all embroidered, that he never wore except on inspection and prize days. Now, so when M. Hamel asked Franz to get in the class, Franz hurried to his seat, and after some time, when he overcame his fear, when he was out of that fear of being scolded, it was then when he realized that he noticed that their teacher had worn his best embroidered dress that day. And then he says that the teacher normally wore such kind of dresses on the occasions like inspection and prize distribution days. So this point would also be coming in the changes that could be seen by Franz on that particular day. Okay, so he had his special dress on that day, M. Hamel. So Franz wondered if that day was a normal day. Then what could be the reason for M. Hamel to wear his special dress? Further, the narrator tells the readers, besides, the whole school seemed so strange and solemn, but the thing that surprised me most was to see, on the back benches that were always empty, the village people sitting quietly like ourselves. Old Hauser, with his three-cornered hat, the former mayor, the former postmaster, and several others. Besides, everybody looked sad, and Hauser had brought an old primer thumbed at the edges, and he held it open on his knees with his great spectacles lying across the pages. So Franz felt that the atmosphere in the school was very strange, not normal, and very unusual, and also solemn. Solemn means very serious kind of environment. To add to it, what happened? To add to it, he says that the last benches of the classroom were occupied by the senior village men. Who all were there? There was the Hauser. Hauser here means the old farmer, and he was wearing his three-cornered hat. There was also a retired mayor, a postmaster, and other people. So they all were looking very sad. Now the narrator tells us that Hauser had brought his primer. Primer, it is an introductory book used by small children in their primary classes. So he had that book, and it was so old and toned up from the edges. So the Hauser had opened the book up and kept it on his knees, and he had also placed his spectacles on it. So by this we come to know that the village people were also there at the back of the class in order to take the French language lessons from Mr. M. Hamel. Let us read ahead. While I was wondering about it all, M. Hamel mounted his chair and, in the same grave and gentle tone which he had used to me, said, "My children, this is the last lesson I shall give you. The order has come from Berlin to teach only German in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine. The new master comes tomorrow. This is your last French lesson. I want you to be very attentive." Now Franz was confused and could not figure out what was happening on that day. Why was everything not normal? Why was everything so unusual and strange? Just then, M. Hamel announced. He told them something, all the students and the village people present over there in the class. He told them that it was their last French lesson, the last French class, as the Prussians in Berlin had ordered that French language would no longer be taught in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine, and also that German language would be taught instead. So no teaching of French language further, and from the next day, the very next day, German would be taught. And also he tells that the German teacher would arrive the next day, and as this was the last lesson in French, so he wanted all of them, everybody, to pay attention to him. Now, this was again a very shocking moment for everyone, especially Franz. He says, "What a thunderclap these words were to me. Oh, the wretches, that was what they had put up at the town hall. It is at this moment when Franz realizes the actual importance of his mother tongue. And after hearing the news of the last lesson from his professor, from his teacher M. Hamel, Franz realizes he is in total shock to know that he could not learn French any longer, and now he was able to understand the latest news that had been put up at the bulletin board of the town hall where the people had gathered earlier in the lesson. Now he says, "My last French lesson. Why, I hardly knew how to write. I should never learn any more. I must stop there, then. Oh, how sorry I was for not learning my lessons, for seeking birds' eggs, or going sliding on the Saar." Saar here is Saar. It's a river which passes through France. This river passes through France. So now this boy Franz, he's regretting for not being so serious towards his studies, and he regrets that he wasted all his time in hunting birds' eggs and playing in the river Saar. Further he says, "My books that had seemed such a nuisance a while ago, so heavy to carry, my grammar and my history of the saints, were old friends now that I couldn't give up, and M. Hamel too. The idea that he was going away, that I should never see him again, made me forget all about his ruler and how cranky he was." So about the books he says that till then Franz had considered his books to be an extra burden, a burden in his life. But suddenly he starts considering them to be his good friends, his best friends, whom he would never be able to leave. Now the writer wants to show the change in Franz. This is important, okay? The writer wants to show the change in Franz's attitude towards study after hearing the news that he could not learn French any longer. Further, and M. Hamel too. Now he says that about M. Hamel, that the news that their teacher M. Hamel was leaving also had a similar impact on him. So he was very much sad with the news that M. Hamel was also leaving them, the students. So Franz did not want him to go away. He no longer thought that the teacher to be short, he no longer thought of the teacher being strict towards them, the teacher being short-tempered towards them. He just didn't wanted him to leave. Let us read ahead. Poor man! It was in honor of this last lesson that he had put on his fine Sunday clothes. And now I understood why the old men of the village were sitting there in the back of the room. So now Franz knew that M. Hamel was wearing his best dress in honor of this last lesson, this last French class. So he now also realized that the village men had come to pay respect, and that M. Hamel, the village people were there to pay respect to the language and also to M. Hamel for his service of 40 years in that school. Now further he says, it was because they were sorry too that they had not gone to school more. It was their way of thanking our master for his 40 years of faithful service and of showing their respect for the country that was theirs no more. This is also important. Why were the village men there? To pay respect to their country, to the language, and also to M. Hamel for his 40 years of service that he had given to the school. So the village men had come to the class as they were also repenting for not having studied well in their childhood. They also wasted their time in earning money. And also, they had come to thank their teacher for his 40 years of service as a teacher of French. Also, they wanted to show respect to their country, and because they were sad as their mother tongue was also, they were not going to practice their mother tongue further, as French would no longer be taught to them in the schools, rather German would be taught. Next paragraph. While I was thinking of all this, I heard my name called. It was my turn to recite. What would I not have given to be able to say that dreadful rule for the participles all through, very loud and clear, and without one mistake? But I got mixed up on the first words and stood there, holding on to my desk, my heart beating and not daring to look up. So now, while he was thinking all this, the teacher calls out to Franz. He calls out his name, and he realizes that it was his turn to recite the topic of participles. It was very dreadful for him. Dreadful is very frightening for him. So as the news had impacted Franz, he was eager to study his language, and so he was very much desperate to show his eagerness also to learn his language, to read in his language without committing any error. So he wanted to be able to recite the topic in one go without any mistake, and also he wanted to please his teacher by doing so. So his desperation is reflected in his willingness to give away all that he had in return for reciting the lesson well. But what he says that he got mixed up. As Franz was not knowing anything about the lessons on participles, so he got confused and stood quietly. And then he says that his heart, my heart beating and not daring to look up. His heart was beating fast as he was ashamed of himself and did not have the courage to face his teacher. We will continue this next part in the next session. Till then, I want you all to reread these passages in a detailed manner and also mark the difficult words. Note them down in a notebook, a separate notebook, and also write their meanings. You can also write the word meaning, mark the word meanings in your words in your book, and also write the meanings in the books as well.